Welcome, everyone. So as you know, the 72nd session of the General Assembly wraps up on Monday. So we're here for our end of session press conference with the president of the 72nd session, Mr. Miroslav Lajčák. We'll start with some opening remarks and then we'll take your questions.
Thank you for coming. Yes, I really believe that before we finish our work, our mandate would be fair to meet with you and offer my view and my assessment of the 72nd session. Let me start with some statistics. As of today, we held 115 General Assembly sessions, of which I chaired personally close to 80. We adopted 312 resolutions. I delivered nearly 300 speeches during this year. I held more than 120 meetings with the United Nations officials and more than 440 meetings with the representatives of member states, including 26 presidents, 16 prime ministers, 8 vice prime ministers, more than 90 ministers or state secretaries. I organized 10 high-level meetings and events. I held more than 80 meetings with outside stakeholders, civil society, and other regional and international organizations. I participated in more than 60 interviews and media engagements, and I undertook 20 trips that took me to 28 countries. Now, speaking about the most important results or achievements of the 72nd session, I would, as number one, mention migration and the fact that on the 13th of July, the member states agreed on the text of the Global Compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration. As you know very well, this is the first agreement negotiated under the auspices of the United Nations General Assembly that addresses the global phenomenon of migration. It recognizes that migration is a shared responsibility of all countries, not only of those where people are migrating to. It helps to strengthen the positive sides of migration and mitigate the risks and the negative sides of migration. It is a political tool. It's not a legally binding document, as you know very well, but it offers the actions for member states and also a platform for countries to share experience and also talk about global challenges. The main purpose is obviously to switch us from the reactive mode to a proactive mode and to respond to migration in an orderly and well-managed approach. You know that this document is to be formally endorsed in December in Marrakesh. As number two, I would mention peace. I've tried to promote the role of the United Nations in protecting peace and preventing conflicts, and in April I hosted a high-level meeting on peace building and sustaining peace, and I was very pleased by the strong positive reaction from the member states. We had 125 member states and 5 observers speaking at the event. We had 5 heads of state, 1 head of government. We had 2 deputy prime ministers, 21 ministers, 16 vice ministers, and the debate took 2.5 days. And the most important outcome, besides of giving greater prominence to the issue of peace, was to turn it into a process. So we requested the Secretary General to provide a report next year and then a comprehensive report a year after. As number 3, I would mention that on the World Water Day, 22nd of March, we launched the International Decade for Action, Water for Sustainable Development, 2018-2028. And the goal of this decade is to improve cooperation, partnership, and capacity development. As number 4, I would mention financing for development, or SDG financing. This is one of the crucial issues, and I organized a high-level event on 11th of June to address the current financing gap, which is a serious issue. And therefore, we brought together representatives from the private sector, academia, governments, UN system, multilateral development banks, think tanks. And as a result we produced a summary report that I circulated to the member states. And together with our international partners, we are working on a toolbox of financing or compendium of insightful recommendations. And this document will be available on a dedicated website that will be officially launched in October this year in Geneva at the World Investment Forum, which I'll be there and I'll be co-launching it. and it will be managed by UNCTAD and will be continuously updated. So the purpose is to help all those who are willing to invest into SDGs to offer practical ways how to do it. Because the fact is that the way we do now, we are not on target. We are not set to meet the 2030 agenda by 2030. As number 5, I would mention accessibility. We speak a lot about accessibility, about making the United Nations accessible to every person, but I believe that we should do more than just talk about it. The United Nations should be leading by example also here. And I myself started providing services in my official events, and I initiated and hosted 2 working lunches dedicated to the issue of inclusion of persons with disabilities, where I invited the member states, UN Secretariat, and persons with disabilities themselves. And to my second lunch, I also invited the President-elect of the 73rd General Assembly to make sure there will be continuity. One concrete outcome of these discussions was the decision to establish a steering committee as a body that will include all stakeholders and will be coordinating the efforts of all parts of the UN system to this. And I'm glad that we've also improved the accessibility of the General Assembly hall. I think you have seen it yourself. As number 6, I would mention our event that we organized for young people in May, Youth Dialogue, which was very different from standard traditional UN events. We opened up to young people. We organized the open mic session, and they came and they spoke, and we were listening. And the key issues that were discussed were education, the chances for employment, prevention from radicalization, and the need for dialogue. As number 7, I would mention reforms. You know very well that this 72nd session was very much about reforms, and on top of traditional reform processes, I'm glad that the General Assembly was able to adopt and approve and process the 3 reform proposals which were submitted by the Secretary General, namely on peace and security architecture, on development system, and on management. And finally, dialogue, transparency, and gender issues. I realized very soon after arriving to my post as a PGA that there are many meetings, many speeches, but very little dialogue. And there is not a real space for a genuine dialogue. So in order to do something about it, I introduced the morning dialogues as an opportunity, as a platform for permanent representatives to meet and to speak freely without scripts, to express their views on issues that are not duplicating the official agenda, but they are very much relevant for the work of the United Nations, such as the role and the rights of women in the work of the United Nations, position of or the problems the small delegations are facing, better cooperation between different UN headquarters, and so on and so forth. We held 14 discussions. They were very much, or I would say, enthusiastically received by the permanent representatives, and they requested the process to continue also beyond this session, which is now formalized also. It's through the resolution on revitalization that requests my successor to continue with this practice. I'm proud to be named a gender champion. You know that 70% of my team were made out of women, and I try to respect strictly the gender balance also when appointing co-chairs and co-facilitators of different processes, which is not so easy given the fact that the share of women permanent representatives is somewhere between 20 and 25%. But out of 38 co-chairs and co-facilitators that I appointed, 20 were men and 18 were women. And finally, I really believe that it's very important for the President of the General Assembly to be as transparent as possible. So I was the first PGA to make my personal financial disclosures available online. I also started some new practices, such as publishing my daily calendar online and issuing official readouts of all my meetings. If you ask me about the challenges, of course the biggest challenge for this organization is the threat to multilateralism that we are facing through big speeches, but also through small actions. And we have to resist, because it's not a coincidence that multilateral system was created after a global catastrophe to make sure that it will not be repeated in the future. It looks like we are forgetting about the raison d'etre for the United Nations, and we need to stand up for multilateralism. And this is what I believe has been the most important elements, or the ones that I try to promote as the President of the General Assembly, to strengthen the multilateralism, and particularly the role of the United Nations as the backbone of multilateralism, to make sure, or at least to contribute to understanding that the General Assembly is not only the most representative international body, but also the most relevant one, and build on the fact that everyone is equal and everyone has the chance to participate on the same basis in the work of the General Assembly. I've also tried to promote dialogue as a working method, because this is what diplomacy is about, and obviously focusing on people, which has not only been the formal theme of my presidency, but also the real goal. That means to make sure that what we do here has an impact, and preferably a positive impact, on the life of people on the ground. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great, thank you. We'll take your questions.
Thanks, Brendan. President Lajčák, on behalf of the UN Correspondents Association, thank you so much for coming to speak to us one last time. And thanks to you and the engagement of your staff, Brendan in particular, and those that serve with him in terms of the engagement with the media. We do appreciate that, and we hope it will continue into the 73rd session. My question is about progress in intergovernmental negotiations regarding Security Council reform in particular. Kindly give us a detailed perspective on where this process stands. We still don't appear to have text-based negotiations and no clear deadline for this process to end, right? I think a lot of people would agree that that is problematic. Given your purview over the last year, do you believe that this is a productive process or an exercise in futility? That's my first question. Secondly, the term of the PGA is 12 months. Do you believe that this is a sufficient amount of time to implement an agenda, or should the term of the PGA be reviewed? And thirdly, is this a position that should be empowered to have more clout within the organization?
Thank you.
At least I made you smile.
Yeah. When it comes to Security Council reform, this is one of the most complicated, most sensitive, and most important issues the United Nations is dealing with, because the fact is that the overall work of the United Nations system is seen by the external world by the performance of the Security Council. And the fact is that every time Security Council is unable to unite and to reach a decision, the entire system gets criticized, and gets criticized harshly. And I've been witness to this, and I've been confronted with this during many of my trips and meetings, and it's difficult to try to point out to so many important things UN is doing in a humanitarian field, in the development area, in peacekeeping area. What people see is obviously the action and the dynamism in the Security Council chamber. The next point on this issue is the fact that it cannot be denied that the current composition of the United Nations Security Council is not representative, because it does not reflect the realities of 2018, of the 21st century. It copies the realities of 1945. So therefore, the call for the reform is just, and it is not denied. It is the understanding that the composition of the new reformed Security Council should better reflect the changed global realities. Obviously, there are many, many practical issues related to it, like if extend to how many members, what about veto right, what about permanent, non-permanent, semi-permanent. There are many, many issues to be discussed. I said at the beginning of this session that I wish to see a credible process that will lead to a meaningful outcome. And this is exactly what you said, whether this is an exercise in futile effort. No, that would be the worst we can do to this organization. if member states don't have the feeling that what they do is real, that the process is not a proxy exercise but a real process, then it would have a very negative impact on the work of the United Nations. So I tried to make sure that we had a credible process, and I think we succeeded on that. The result of this process was adopted unanimously. Now, how meaningful was the progress we achieved? I think here the views of different member states would differ. For some, we went very far. For some others, this was not far enough. But it's really important that the process continues, that I wish the next year's discussion be built and based on the results of this year's discussion. I wish we do not move in circles, but year after year, session after session, we have a feeling that we are getting closer to agreeing on what the next Security Council should look like. This is extremely important because the importance of this issue goes way beyond the role of the Security Council. On the 12 months, that's the fact, that's the reality. Obviously, I know much more about the United Nations and the General Assembly than I knew a year ago. I've learned so much, and it would be much easier for me to start now, but this is how it is decided. This is what the rules and the Charter says, and I don't think it's realistic to speculate about extending the term, because that would also mean that it would also extend the waiting time for those countries that are willing to offer the President of the General Assembly. I would rather focus on strengthening the institutional memory of the office, because it still depends very much on the goodwill of the persons that are holding this office. And this has been the case, the goodwill has been there. Lately I had all the support from my predecessors, and I've extended all the support to my successor. But I really believe that there should be some continuity also when it comes to personnel. There should be some institutional memory when it comes to papers, to documents, because this role has really grown in its importance. This is what member states want. But as it's sometimes the case at the United Nations, member states decide they want something, and then they vote against supporting this something with concrete practical steps and also with the budget. So, and when it comes to you ask about the empowerment of the PJ, I think this position gives you all the possibilities to have the real power, real influence, as long as member states support your agenda, as long as they identify themselves with what you do, as long as they all see you as their President of the General Assembly, you can exercise a real influence and real political role. And again, my feeling has been that this is what member states want, because President of the General Assembly is the face of the General Assembly, and a strong PGA represents a strong General Assembly.
Great, thanks. Let's go to Anadolu, Turkish News.
Thank you, Mr. President. Betül Yürük, Anadolu Agency. One of the biggest critics of the UN and the whole system has been the US President, Donald Trump. How do you think the US withdrawal from international agreements and from various UN organizations affected the system? And how concerned that the US withdrawal from the entire system, how worried are you if the US withdrew from the entire UN system? Thank you.
Well, when I met with President Trump September last year, he made it very clear to me that he believes that the United Nations can play a very important role, that it has a strong potential, that this potential has not been used fully, and that he believes that there is a chance and that he's willing to support United Nations in using its full potential. In the meantime, or since then, we have seen withdrawals of the United States from several important processes or organizations. I can mention the Migration Compact or the Human Rights Council. I've expressed my regret on every occasion when it happened, and I do regret this withdrawal because I really believe that we are stronger together, and I am also absolutely convinced that we are facing challenges of nature that makes it impossible for a single member state to deal with them on its own. And therefore, global challenges require global cooperation. All we can say at this point is that the door remains open, and we will be very pleased when the United States decides to return to the institutions, bodies, and also the processes of the United Nations.
With AFP, yeah, Carol.
Mr. President, if I can take you back to last year when President Trump made that explosive headline-grabbing speech at UNGA. A year on, how would you describe relationships between UN member states and the Trump administration? Do you think that there's growing impatience, indifference? Well, what's your take on that situation?
The speech was explosive, but what followed was a very positive development when we speak about the DPRK. And this is what I applaud and welcome. Second, United States is, of course, a very important member of the United Nations. As you know, is the #1 contributor to the regular budget, to the peacekeeping budget, and also #1 provider of voluntary contributions. So we value and appreciate that. And it's really important that we use the United Nations and the General Assembly as a platform to discuss issues on which we might differ or have different opinions. But I have not seen tensions or let alone confrontation. There are different views, but that's legitimate. There have been many votes on many issues, so this is how it is. You see sometimes consensual, sometimes majority will of the General Assembly, but there is no reason to panic, I believe, or to get very nervous. This is why we've created the United Nations.
AP, Edie?
Thank you very much. And thank you for doing so many press events, and thank Brendan also for being always available to us. A couple of questions. First, what do you see as the major issues that are going to be on the minds of world leaders when they come here in 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks? Secondly, on the migration compact, are you optimistic that Are you optimistic that there are going to be a significant number of major signatories to the compact so that it will actually have some effect on the ground? And as a follow-up to a statement that you made in regard to Security Council reform, you said this has the importance goes well beyond the Security Council. I wonder if you could elaborate on that. Thank you.
First, on the major issues to dominate the high-level week and the general debate, I don't think they will be very different from what we had last September. And last September, the most frequently mentioned issue was climate change and sustainable development goals. We had more than 80% of speakers referring to these issues, and they continue to be very important. I expect calls for strengthening multilateralism. I believe Syria will be on the agenda and will be mentioned, given the very sensitive stage of the process, both on the ground around Idlib and also when it comes to the diplomatic effort, Geneva process and Astana process. So these are my expectations. Regarding Global Compact, I expect overwhelming support for this document. You know that the US withdrew at the beginning of the intergovernmental negotiations, and the government of Hungary announced after the completion of the process that they are disassociating themselves. But I believe that the rest of the international community will stick to their commitments, because this was the very inclusive process. Everybody participated in that. We had 6 rounds of intergovernmental negotiations, and we spent more than a year explaining, understanding, and building trust among everyone. So, and this is the result. And I'm very much encouraged that on such a sensitive issue as migration is, we were able to reach an agreement on the text of this document. And with regard to its impact on the ground, I like to say that Sustainable Development Goals are a political document as well. They are not legally binding, and yet in 3 years they have changed fundamentally the way we deal with the development agenda. They have changed the way the member states are planning the development activities. They have adopted their development strategies. 112 of them have come back to the General Assembly to report about the progress. So this has fundamentally changed the way we address development, and I believe that Global Compact has the potential to change the way we look at migration and we deal with migration issues. And on the Security Council and the importance that goes beyond, I can mention two aspects. First, from the perspective of a global public. As I said, most of people judge the overall performance of the United Nations through the performance of the Security Council. And you see that when the Security Council is able to act in unity, such as in case of DPRK or Myanmar, we have seen a positive shift on the ground. While in cases when the unity is not there, like many times on Syria, you see growing frustration. And the second aspect that confirms what I said about this importance is obviously the perspective of member states. They have to feel that the Security Council represents them all, and they have to see that they have to be identified with the work of the Security Council. And this will not be the case for as long as there are important countries who believe that they are not adequately represented, or continents, and obviously started with Africa. So that's why this process is very important.
Let's go to Reuters, Michelle.
Thank you, PGA 72. I've got it's sort of a follow-on, I guess, from some of the early questions, and you've touched on this. You mentioned in your opening remarks that there is this threat to multilateralism. For our viewers and our readers out on the street, can you just tell us in plain terms, what is that threat and why should they care?
We are clearly shifting from the world that was dominated by one power to a world where there are several poles, to a multilateral world. But I just don't see this process to be orderly and regulated. I just don't see this process to be discussed. It's somehow happening, without any rules. And there is a risk that those who feel powerful may try to establish their own rules within their, reach or spheres of interest, if you wish so. And there have been violation of international agreements, norms, rules, without punishment or without adequate reaction, which again can trigger others to do the same. And this trend is there, and therefore we really have to raise our voice to demand that everyone respects the rules, and it does not really depend how big or how small the country is, to make sure that we will not find ourselves in a world that we don't like, because there is no adequate alternative to multilateralism. It's either anarchy, chaos, or then the different sets of rules imposed by different players according to their liking.
Would you care to name some names?
Of course not.
Ma Jianguo from Xinhua News Agency. I have two questions. Actually, it'll be three. One, before you take your office, that's a year ago, you said preventive diplomacy and sustaining peace is one of your priority. And have you reached the goals? So a year later, have you reached the goals? The first. Second, and yesterday marked the UN South-South Cooperation Day. What role South-South Cooperation is playing in reaching the 2030 goals, and what role China is playing? Thank you.
I do believe that we should do a better job in preventive diplomacy. I really believe that this is the core of diplomacy, because if we are unable to keep peace, to preserve peace, then we are good for nothing, and then we can invite military people to do their job, which they know the best. So, I've tried to address what is a bit of a gray area when we see that things are developing in a dangerous direction, when we, so to say, see the warning lights flashing, but it's not clear what tools do we have at our disposal, how can we use them. Obviously, the issue of the responsibility to protect vis-à-vis the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states comes into play, and I really believe we need to talk about these issues. And this is what I tried to do through several events, and the high-level event in April was a culmination. We have published a book, Brendan introduced the book to you earlier this week, about everything that we have tried to do during this 72nd session dedicated to the prevention of conflicts and preventive diplomacy as such. Have we reached the goal? Obviously not. Have we moved the envelope? Have we helped to promote the agenda? I hope so, including by the fact that it is now a process that will be revisited year after year, and the General Assembly will have the time to discuss whether we are progressing or not on this issue. South-South cooperation is very important to build a feeling of global partnership and to break existing stereotypes, particularly when it comes to the North-South dynamic. So I really believe that the Global South has a lot to offer, and this is the mean and the platform how to demonstrate this.
James Bays, Al Jazeera. Mr. President, if I can come back to UN reform, but very specifically to your post, the President of the General Assembly, because we saw with the corruption allegations against late President Ash, there were problems. So I'd like, after a year of doing the job, your reflections on the job, and in an ideal world, what could change to make the job better, more effective? I mean, it has this very high stature in the Charter. If you could change the Charter, should this be a 2-year job, a 3-year job? Should you have more resources? Should, for example, you start on the 1st of October so that the biggest thing you do isn't just days after you start the job, it comes as the crowning glory of the job? What would you change about the way the PGA works?
I would not go in the direction of extending the term in office, because, as I said, it rotates, and the member states have a right to apply for the job and to get the job. I personally think that there will be more and more votings within the regional groups, which is logical given the growing importance of this position and also the political influence. And if all the changes are in the hands of the member states, which I fully respect, if you ask me for my personal opinion, I would think about two things, or two areas. First, to make the transition phase more institutional, more based on a system and rules, and because right now it really depends on the goodwill of people. And fortunately, it has been here, but it's not guaranteed. So I think it's in the interest of the General Assembly to establish some procedures that would have to be followed, that would allow the incoming PGA to be more involved into the activities in the closing part of the mandate of her predecessor, so that the transition is smooth. What goes with it is also, as I said, the institutional memory and also the personal continuity. So that would be good to, and it has been a case. 1/3 of my team were people who used to work in previous team or teams. But again, it was my choice, my decision. So I really believe that it's in the interest of the system to make sure that the part of the team are the people who really continue and are the guarantee that continuity is there. And second, the issue that is very actively discussed by the member states is, of course, the beginning of the General Assembly vis-à-vis the beginning of the high-level week. Right now, it's 1 week difference that's far from ideal. It's not ideal at all. You really have to hit the ground running, and as I said, there are no rules that guarantee that this will be the case. So the ideas vary from moving the beginning of the General Assembly by 1 week, so it gives the new PJ 2 weeks. Then there are ideas about 1st of August, 1st of July, 1st of January. There are ideas that are saying that basically the high-level week should be the culmination and not the beginning of the term in office for the PGA. They are all legitimate. What we have now is not ideal. But the member states so far have not been able to agree on any of these proposals. We've discussed this also in our morning dialogues. We had a fantastic discussion, but I sometimes joke that we need to strengthen the link between the PRs in the morning dialogues and the same PRs in formal sessions. So the discussion will continue, and I really believe I made it very clear on several occasions that these issues better be addressed because this is in the interest of the General Assembly.
Yes, Mr. Abadi.
Thank you, Brendan. Thank you, Mr. President, for this briefing. You mentioned reforms of the Security Council, and you indicated that the process will continue. It has taken more than a quarter of a century. I myself participated in the negotiations of the reform of the Security Council. Are you concerned that the matter has become a routine question, one? And two, do you think that a reform of the Security Council needs reform of the Charter? Thank you.
Well, starting with your second question, obviously the agreement on the reform will require changes in the Charter. If we speak about real reform of the Security Council, and whether I'm concerned that this will become a routine question, I'm not, because I'm certain that the member states will not allow for this to become a routine question. Honestly, I was taken aback by the level of emotions and also level of frustration when we started the discussions about the Security Council reform during this session. So the member states have very clear, very strong positions, and many of them will make sure that this will not become a routine. It's impossible for this to become a routine. It's too important, too big, and too sensitive.
Let's go to ARD.
Thanks. Mr. President, George Schwarte, German Public Radio. Since you mentioned the state of the world and you're a convinced European, is there this time a special role, even a responsibility for countries like France, Germany, or the European Union here at the UN?
Sure it is. France is doing its part as a permanent member of the Security Council, who knows exactly what is expected from them. When it comes to Germany, we have expectations from coming 2 years term on the Security Council for Germany. When it comes to the European Union, I I wish to see a more active role of the European Union within the UN system. Given the fact that both the European Union and the United Nations are born and built on the same principles. And also given the fact that the European Union, together with its member states, is the major contributor to the UN budget, I would expect the European Union to be more visible, especially at times when we are facing challenges to the work of the United Nations, to the budgeting of the United Nations. I made these views very clear during my visit to Brussels in March when I met with the President of the European Council, President of the European Commission, President of the European Parliament. I do not hide the feeling that European Union is not fully using or being aware fully of its role as a global player. And regardless of the fact that there are many internal issues that European Union is busy with, there are also global expectations from the European Union, and I would wish EU to be more responsive to its global role and global responsibility.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone. And we'll see you all at 5:30 this evening. The President has invited all of you to a reception with all UN correspondents in the Riverview cafeteria on the 4th floor.
And before going, I want to thank you all very much for a very constructive cooperation we had with you and for your friendship. Thank you very much.
Before you go, could you tell us what your plans are? Are you going back to be foreign minister? Are you going on vacation? What are you going to do?
Yes, when I was taking over from Peter Thompson, he told me that as soon as he hands over the gavel, he goes on 3 weeks vacation to Greece. I go immediately back home to Slovakia to fully resume my post as the Minister of Foreign and European Affairs of Slovakia. My government is waiting, my ministry is waiting, so there will be no vacation. I will spend 3.5 working days in Bratislava, and then I will come back for the next high-level debate in my national capacity, so don't be surprised when you see me around. It's not that I'm refusing to accept that my mandate has come to an end, or it's not my coast. And we are getting ready for the next important challenge. Slovakia will be chairing the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, next year, which again requires lots of work, lots of action. So I'm very much excited to be the chairman in office of OSCE next year. Thank you very much.
Brendan, what will you be doing?
I'll still be in the building. Yeah, I'll tell you up. I'll tell you at 5:30 today.